Welcome to the show, Normal America with Rob Knorr. This is November 12th, 2020. Thank you so much for being here. So, I had a great day yesterday. Talk a little about that briefly. My wife's due January 6th with our first baby. So, because of COVID and stuff like that, once you enter the hospital, they don't want you or the husband leaving. So, we had to get a go bag ready for 5 days. So, yesterday through Veterans Day, which, again, thank you to all of our veterans. You're the reason that a show like this is possible and that we have a free country. But we went out and we got that go bag ready, and it was a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun with my wife and her sister, so a good day. It was definitely a good day. So today, I have to be honest, I will bring this up again later in the show once more people are here. But I don't know how long I'll be able to do the show because I'm dog sitting. So I normally own 2 dogs. I have my mother-in-law's 2 dogs as well. And I'm hoping they decide not to run amok while I'm doing the show. That's the plan anyways. So if I have to cut out early, it's because my dogs are doing something insane that I'm watching. So just to give a heads up. But welcome to the show. I'm glad to have everyone here. So I got to be honest, it's hard to do the show every day when it's kind of the same situation. We're stuck in this sort of limbo trying to find out what happens with court cases and things like that with allegations of election fraud. So it gets tough it's hard to move on from that because it is the biggest story, obviously. It has dire consequences for our country if Trump loses. But at the same time, it doesn't seem that there's a lot of new information coming. So I think I have some new stuff today. It's going to be a lot of material. What's up, Ramon? It's going to be a lot of material from other people that we're going to go through, one of which is a big Twitter thread that I think piggybacks off the big story that I was talking about yesterday, which is the treatment of the USPS Postal Service whistleblower in Erie. What's up, Geeter Dunn? Thanks for being here. So we'll talk about that story. So let me just rehash real quick where we're at without talking any election fraud the day of the election whatsoever. This election was stolen. The Democrats that told you that 12 Russian trolls could steal an election in the 2016 election have no problem with almost the entirety of our social media tech companies being propagandists for Joe Biden, almost the entirety of our media being propagandists for Joe Biden, almost the entirety of our intel community and State Department being propagandists for Joe Biden and wielding their power to go after Trump. All right, so if you're just joining me, I'm dog sitting. I have 2 dogs. I'm dog sitting 2 more. Lucy, be reasonable. She's just... Get away. Come here. Come here, Lucy. Come here. Come here. Come on. Come on. All right, Dorothy, you come up. You want to say hi, everyone? They're all very, what's the word I'm looking for? Anxious because there's more dogs than usual. Base Liberty D Live says, tell my pathetic mods to unban people. I don't know why they banned someone. If you can tell me specifically, PM me and tell me specifically who you think should be unbanned and why they were banned. If I have any mods, it's like 1. So I don't know who that would have been. I've personally banned people for like anti-Semitism and things like that, but that's all that I could think of. Anyways, what's up, Roy? How's it going? Yeah, the dogs, they're crazy today. Somehow setting them. So anyways, so the election was stolen for those reasons, even before we get to election day fraud. And for any Democrat that spent years telling you Russia, 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 that was all garbage, understand that Will Snyder got booted yesterday for trolling. Oh, maybe. Yeah. I can't really pay attention to a lot of that stuff. That's why I have the mods. In my experience, the mods have been very good. Like I said, if you ever have a problem with a mod, feel free to reach out to me in a message. I'll put my email up. So my email is just my name. It's rob.knorr@gmail.com. And I'll put that in the chat so everyone can see. But yeah, if you have any advice for me, any criticism, anything you wanted to ask me, go ahead and shoot me an email. I can't promise I get to everyone's. It depends on how many I'm getting, but I'll try my best. So, and also, just so you know, I'm on YouTube, DLive, Twitch, and podcasting right now on Podbean. That podcast will later be put up at Stitcher, It'll be put up at iTunes. It'll be put up at Spotify. So check me out on all of those platforms for when YouTube eventually boots me off. So I really recommend DLive. I'm trying to push it because it seems to be the best as far as being a free speech advocate that I'm on right now. So, but yeah, these people that said Russia for 4 years, now they're saying, oh, you can't say that an election was unfair. You can't say, and it's just obviously disingenuous as we talked about yesterday. So I'm not going to rehash all of that. What I thought I would start with today is a clip from the opening of Tucker Carlson's show last night. Now, I have no love for Fox News. I do not watch it. I don't even have cable. But I do like Tucker, and sometimes I'll check Tucker out on YouTube the day after and see what he was up to. I think that he's probably the best mainstream pundit out there. That's just my preference. I think that he's been speaking a lot of truth. One of the things I trust about Tucker is, Ramon says it always lags on DLive. I'm going to work on that issue. I don't know why that is, but it works on every other platform, so I don't know why DLive, but I'll see what I can do. Anyways, Tucker I really like. I think that he's willing to call out Trump or Republicans when they should be. I don't always agree with them, but I respect that. And I think that he's been on the forefront of a lot of these stories that are incredibly important in this country. So sometimes I check them out. I do recommend that you, as best as possible, stop watching Fox. If there's someone particularly you like on Fox, try to not watch it on their network because it gives them advertising dollars. Fox hates you. It hates this country like the rest of the mainstream media. They are propagandists. They pretend to be right-wing, but they're not. They are just establishment propagandists, the same as CNN, the same as MSNBC. They're going to start going after Joe Biden, and they'll be critical of Joe Biden because they're going to be desperate to get their viewers back. So if Biden wins the presidency, they'll be more critical of Joe Biden than CNN and MSNBC. But trust me when I tell you, they will never say anything that would incredibly damage him. They're going to be on his side and just be controlled opposition. That's all they'll be. Every advertising dollar that you give to Fox News will go to helping the press be the enemy of this country. Just wanted to let you know. So I've not seen the video of Dr. Shiva. So what we're going to do is play a clip from Tucker's show last night, the opening. It's going to be like 6 or 7 minutes, so bear with me.
Among those votes, auditors will find a ballot cast by a woman called Deborah Jean Christensen. It'd be hard to find anyone who's got a bad word to say about Deborah Jean Christensen. She was well known in her community for years as a bird watcher, an avid gardener, a committed fan of the Georgia Bulldogs. Those who knew her were sad when she died last May, and they might be surprised to learn that even after her death, Deborah Jean Christensen still managed to register to vote and then cast a ballot, presumably for Joe Biden. In some ways, it's an inspiring story, the triumph of voting over death. And no one quite embodies that story like James Blaylock of Covington, Georgia. Mr. Blaylock was a mailman for 33 years until he passed away in 2006. 14 years later, according to state records, he was still mailing things. James Blaylock cast a ballot in last week's election. How did he do that? It might be worth asking the New York Times. Maybe James Blaylock was just one of those extraordinary mail carriers. Neither rain, nor snow, nor gloom of night, nor even death itself could keep him from the mail. In his case, maybe voting from the grave wasn't really fraud, it was just commitment. Okay, but what about Linda Kessler of Nicholson, Georgia? Linda Kessler died in 2003. 17 years later, she was still voting in presidential elections. Edward Swinott of Trenton, Georgia, spent his life working construction and teaching school. In his spare time, he loved bluegrass music. According to those who knew him, he played multiple instruments and enjoyed jam sessions. When he died 5 years ago at the age of 82, it seemed like he was gone from this world for good. But no, last week he voted for president. And he wasn't the only one. On your screen right now, you will see the names of other deceased voters. Every one of them played a role in last week's presidential election. As of tonight, there aren't enough of them to alter the outcome. That could change as we learn more. But for the moment, the point is, they exist. They are dead, but they voted anyway. The question is, how did they do that? How exactly did they cast their ballots? And the short answer is, by mail. Dead people tend to vote more often when you make it easier for them to vote. They're like any other group. And this year we made it much easier for the dead to vote. States sent ballots and registration forms to millions of people totally unsolicited. The pretext was COVID. We had to do this for public health reasons, remember? We had no choice. It was a public health emergency. The effect was to encourage fraud. One 2012 study by Pew found there were close to 2 million dead people still on voter rolls around this country. That study also found that approximately 24 million voter registrations, that is 1 out of every 8 in America, were wrong. They were no longer valid, or they were significantly incorrect. Close to 3 million people in America had registrations in more than one state. 3 million. So what happens if you start sending ballots and registrations to lists like this? Well, you're guaranteed to increase the amount of fraudulent voting. And that's exactly what Democrats did. Republicans, we should add, let them do it. Take the state of Nevada, where Joe Biden is currently leading Donald Trump by fewer than 40,000 votes. This year, state Democrats and their lawyers made certain that Nevada sent ballots, not ballot applications, but actual ballots, to every single registered voter in the state, whether they requested those ballots or not. And they did this even though they knew, they were perfectly aware, that more than 41,000 people who are registered to vote in Nevada haven't voted or updated their registrations in more than 10 years. Why? Because many of these people are dead or gone, but they got ballots anyway. One of those people was a former elementary school teacher called Rosemary Hartle. According to her 2017 obituary, Rosemary Hartle was a loving, fun, sassy, and sarcastic in a fun way. Beautiful, powerful, relentless, and inspiring. Sadly, now she's gone. But her voter registration remains. She's still on the rolls. Someone received Rosemary Hartle's ballot in the mail and then cast it. Who did this? We don't know who did it. We wish we did. We should know. It's fraud. It's a threat to our system. And it's being hidden by a news media totally vested in a Joe Biden presidency. Again, we have a right to know. We have an obligation to know much more about this. But thanks to the media blackout, it is left to independent conservative sites, places like The Federalist, to report what the rest should be reporting but are not. Thanks to The Federalist, we know that on October 9th, for example, a man called Fred Stokes Jr. received an unsolicited ballot in Clark County, Nevada. That's where Las Vegas is. 3 weeks later, the county received his ballot back by mail. Voting records indicate that ballot was, quote, completed. Fred Stokes voted for president. But Fred Stokes had been dead for 3 years. He died in June of 2017 at the age of 92. How'd that happen? We don't know. No one's reporting on it. In Pennsylvania, the state that made Joe Biden the president-elect, there are likely quite a few dead voters. How do we know that? Because the state told us. According to a report from last December, less than a year ago, from the state's Department of Auditor General, nearly 3,000 potentially deceased voters remained on the voter rolls in Pennsylvania. The Trump campaign says it has found evidence that some of them voted this year. For example, on October 24th, Allegheny County officials mailed a ballot to one Denise Odnick. She died 2 days before. Yet somehow records show that county officials received that ballot back, completed, voted for president, on November 2nd. Again, we're showing you more names on the screen just like Denise Odnick's. We can confirm that they all voted in the election last week, and all of them were dead when they did so. None of this is conjecture. It's not one of those bogus conspiracy theories that CNN worries about. It is entirely real. Why did it happen? How can we prevent it from happening again? Those are the questions. The first is very simple to answer. Democrats did it. They understand that when you send mail-in ballots to an entire unverified voter roll, you can't really know who's voting. But just to make certain that fraud remained likely, Democrats filed lawsuits in Nevada to eliminate signature verification. Think about that. In 2019, well before the coronavirus panic, Ron Wyden, this is a Democratic senator from Oregon, sponsored the Vote by Mail Act. The Vote by Mail Act demands that every state in the union mails ballots to their entire unverified voter list. Whether you ask for it or not, whether you're alive or not, you get a ballot. There's no other way to interpret this. Democrats are abetting fraud. This summer, Democrats in the House of Representatives passed something called the HEROES Act. It wouldn't simply have provided, quote, automatic mailing of absentee ballots to all voters in America. It also would have prevented states from restricting in any way ballot harvesting. That means that anyone could collect and return bundles of ballots from dead or living voters to polling stations, and there would be no oversight of this at all. That's insane, but expect more of it. Loose voting rules are too useful for the left to pass up. In January, Democrats could very well gain control of the United States Senate. If that happens, much will change, but one of the things that will happen, they will pass the HEROES Act into law. Right now, they're claiming universal mail-in balloting is necessary because of coronavirus. It's a public health emergency. We have to have it. But they're lying. They've been pushing for this very thing for years, for one reason. It gives them an advantage because it increases the incidence of fraud. According to Barack Obama, the most divisive president in our history, if you're against this, if you're against sending ballots to unverified voter lists in every state in the country, unsolicited, you are a racist. Watch.
Even as we sit here, there are those in power who are doing their darndest to discourage people from voting by closing polling locations and targeting minorities and students with restrictive ID laws and attacking our voting rights with surgical precision, even undermining the Postal Service in the run-up to an election that's going to be dependent on mail-in ballots so people don't get sick.
Barack Obama, suddenly not from Hawaii, didn't go to Punahou, a product of the red clay of Georgia, and he's preaching. And the message is always the same. Obey or I'll call you racist. Obama spent 8 years working that scam pretty effectively, but amazingly, a lot of people still fall for it. So they shut up and obey. But we should stop doing that. Because if we care about our democracy, we must demand clean and honest voting, regardless of the outcome, no matter who wins or who loses. The system is what we must protect. Sending ballots to entire unverified voter lists, unsolicited, gets you dead people voting. And what does that do? It puts us where we are now. Cynical, distrustful, withdrawn. If you want to run a democracy, you need one thing above all: social trust. If you want people to have social trust, if you want them to believe in the system, it's not enough to yell at them on television and tell them that they must believe. You have to create a system that is worth believing in. Adam Laxalt is the former Attorney General of Nevada.
So, yeah, I mean, I thought there was a lot of good information there that's worth talking about. So what I wanted to focus on today was sort of the dead people voting. Yes, dead people are able to vote more because of mail-in balloting, particularly universal mail-in ballot as opposed to requesting absentee ballots. So let's talk about the difference quickly here. Absentee ballots have been something that's occurred for as long as I've been alive, and that is a process set up that you could request a ballot if for some reason you would have difficulty getting to the polls. Now, the beauty of this system is that you're forced to prove your identity in order to get this absentee ballot. The difference between that and universal mail-in ballot is as follows. In the absentee, you're proving that you want a ballot. You're speaking to someone. You're proving who you are getting that ballot. Universal mail-in ballots, it just follows the voter registration rules, which, as Tucker correctly identifies, can be wrong, sometimes to the tune of millions of people having things like voter registration in multiple states, people that have passed away, people that have switched party, and things like that that don't properly show up in the voter registration rules. It's not controversial to say that these rolls are horribly managed and oftentimes are bloated with tons of names that don't really identify correctly who is voting. I read you a study from the BBC, or an article from the BBC, that talks about what voter turnout is in places like Australia where there's compulsory voting. And it says in Australia, when it's illegal not to vote, not only 90 to 95% of the people vote. And the big reason for this is because that's how much bloat there is in their voter registration rules. 5 to 6% of additional people that aren't alive or that no longer have the ability to vote for whatever reason. And so even in places where everyone has to vote, it's not 100% turnout because there's large chunks of that voter registration roll that's inaccurate. The same is true here. So why would you send ballots out to everyone knowing that there are going to be inaccuracies, even if it's only 4 to 5%. Rand Paul had a warning put on one of his tweets where he correctly points out that 1.1 million Americans who were dead received information about stimulus checks during the COVID pandemic. Now, if 1.1 million received checks, what makes you think they didn't receive ballots? So when the New York Times and when everyone else says there's no such thing as voter fraud, of course there is. These are definitively proven cases of dead people voting in this election. Now, my friends on the left will say, but is it substantial enough to overturn the results of election? I don't know. But I'll bet you for each one they catch, there's another 10 out there that they don't. And maybe way more than that. And this is just talking about dead people voting. What about the litany of other people that just don't vote? How many people would be shocked to go check that didn't vote, to check the voter rolls and find out, oh, this says I voted? And what's the punishment if not? We never investigate these claims of fraud. We just say, well, it's expected, so let it go. So what's to stop people from doing this in the future? Again, the Democrats are pushing for this system because they know that they could benefit from the corruption that results from this mail-in ballot fraud. We're not talking about huge degrees of separation between candidates. Certainly, regardless of what you think as a Trump supporter, there were millions of Joe Biden voters. Certainly true. I knew that it would be a close election. In close elections, the more fraud you have, the more likely it is that you end up with a candidate that the will of the people did not want. Why would we have a system set up where it's likely that that will eventually occur? Even if it wasn't this time, which again, I think it was. I think that the fraud shows it. Now, I want to take a step back and say something that I've been saying for 2 years. I talked about how I thought the Democrats would steal this election. I talked about how you should never underestimate the corruption of the establishment. And I was laughed off by a lot of Trump supporters and Republicans, not just on my channel, but in real life as well. One of the things I said repeatedly was, if they're willing to intentionally collapse the economy and have partisan reactions to COVID where left-wingers are allowed to go protest and riot, right-wingers have to stay home, they're not allowed to go to work. They intentionally put elderly people with COVID in nursing homes, thereby killing tens of thousands of people in nursing homes with COVID. They encouraged riots or were silent on them as they burned down the state. What riots? What? Mostly peaceful. If they're willing to do all of that, why would they be unwilling to cheat Election Day? They were willing to have the mainstream media blatantly ignore any stories critical of Joe Biden 2 weeks before the election. Asking them questions about ice cream and stuff like that. Why would they not engage in election fraud then? Are there ever consequences? I mean, there was a coup against the president from our intel agency with basically no consequences. So why would they hesitate to steal the election? Now, I want you to think about something for a minute. We kind of talked about this a little yesterday. Scott Adams put this best, but I think that I would like to talk about it as well. In order to think that the Democrats didn't steal this election, and we know how close it was, this is what you have to believe. That the Democrats legitimately believe that Trump is a Nazi, that he's Hitler, that he's a racist, that he's evil. Yet they took a chance and rolled the dice that they could win a fair election. If you think the guy's not a Nazi, like, I have friends that personally told me I had ballots sent to my house for people that don't live here. Let's say you're that person. Let's say you're a man and a woman. You live in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and you believe the Democratic Party that Trump's a Nazi, that he's a racist, that he's evil, that he's an existential threat to this world. That's what the media has been telling you. It's what the Democrats have been telling you for 4 years. So you believe it, right? You believe it so much so that you've maybe even supported Black Lives Matter. Maybe even supported some of the riots because you said, well, it was justified, right? So you're sitting at home and your ballot comes, but there's 3 other ballots for people that don't live there. You gonna just throw those ballots away? You gonna inform someone? I mean, you're willing to put your life on the line. Many of these people, they're willing to go out to riots. But they're not going to be willing to fill out these couple ballots that came to their house. That's what you're telling me? Now, how many houses got those ballots? Why would we accept a system like this? Why did we change the way we vote 3 months out? Dr. Fauci told us we could vote in person. The left had no problem with Black Lives Matter rallies by the hundreds of thousands. So why would going to a polling station be disallowed? It's interesting, isn't it? So it becomes very difficult then to take the left seriously when they were upset about 12 Russian trolls. They thought that stole an election. Right, knowing Biden's favorite flavor of ice cream was very important into the election. That's what occurred. Can you blame people for thinking like that? They were gaslit by the Democrats to think that Trump was literally a Nazi. So you don't think they'd be willing to do stuff like this? How many times did it occur? How many people thought they didn't vote, but their ballot got sent to someone else's house and they filled it out for them? If you're going to massively change the way we do elections 3 months before the election, in probably the most consequential election in my lifetime, why would you then not change the way that you count the ballots? In other words, why wouldn't you audit that vote? Not just recount, but audit. It wouldn't be hard. Every ballot you got, you contact the person who sent the ballot to the best of your ability. Oh, excuse me, got a sneeze here. You say, did you vote? You don't ask who for. Did you vote? And see how many yeses you get. Five plus, yeah. I'll reach out to you about making emotes. I don't know how to do that, yeah. So it's very odd then. The people that are telling us, oh, there was no election fraud, well, okay, yeah, some dead people voted. Why wouldn't we want to get to the bottom of that? What's the rationale here? Well, it was just a handful of dead people voting. So far. I mean, I find it odd. The left is the same people that will say this. We have millions of police interactions with people every day. Tens of millions a year, if not more. 700,000 law enforcement officers in this country alone. Every day interacting with multiple people. In 2019, we had 15 unarmed blacks shot by the police. Yet that, to them, is systemic racism. We need to look at everything with the magnifying glass. We need to defund the police, etc., etc., etc. Now, that's far less than 0.00001% of police interactions resulted in that. Yet, they say we need to look at the whole system. I don't disagree, by the way. I'm disagreeing with the defund the police. But the potential for heinous action and bad actions by police, even if it's incredibly small, should warrant a full look at what's going on. Why would it be any different when it comes to voting? Now, granted, we're not talking about people being shot and killed, but the left tells us all the time, oh, voting, it's all right. It's so important. Everyone has to have access to voting. Well, given that, if we could see clear examples of dead people voting, this wasn't an accident either. A dead person doesn't vote by accident. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Now, you might say, okay, but there's safeguards put into place in all these states to make sure that if someone tries to be fraudulent and fill out a ballot that's not their own, there are safeguards that would be able to catch that. Really? Is that the case? Would it surprise you to know that in Nevada and in Pennsylvania, which I know more about Pennsylvania because I'm here, your signature on your ballot does not have to match your voter registration? Did you know that? That's what a court in Pennsylvania said, which is now being challenged. What's the possible justification for that? So we send ballots out. We know that a bunch of people, the ballots are going to, just think about it. Have you ever got a piece of mail in someone else's name? Of course you have. But now we're going to base our country and the future of our country off of that system? And if you fill out the ballot, your name doesn't even have to match the voter registration card, your signature. Why would they do that? Right, it's like not even requiring an ID to vote. Now, I can tell you a little about Pennsylvania because me and my co-host Todd Bartley have been investigating this story for months leading into the election. Originally, there were supposed to be different piles of ballots that were kept because they knew there would be court challenges. So imagine this. You get a ballot, you're a poll worker, you get a ballot, it comes through the mail. You open the envelope, and then you proceed to check the ballot and count it. So there are several ways that people could have voted. One, you could have voted in person the day of the election. Those ballots are easy to count. Got it. So that's kept in one pile. The second pile was ballots that came through mail, that were postmarked properly, that had signatures that matched the voter registration. Fine, got it. Those ballots also go into the pile that there's no discrepancy with. But then there were two other piles. Three actually. The first pile was ballots that came in after November 3rd, but were postmarked before November 3rd. So let's say you put your ballot in the mail November 2nd, but it didn't get to the poll station until November 4th. There were legal challenges as to whether or not those would be acceptable. Those were to be kept in a pile of their own. That way, if the Supreme Court determines, no, actually, you can't count those, we would know exactly which ballots needed to be thrown out. Now, how would you know which ballots go in that pile? Well, because of the envelope that they came in, where the postmark was. The next pile of ballots that they were supposed to keep were ones whose signatures did not match the voter registration. Because again, there is going to be a court challenge. It was already in courts. It's being appealed. That says, no, you cannot count ballots if their signature doesn't match their voter registration. Pennsylvania's court of Democrats said, yes, you can count them, which is horrible, which is rife with fraud, but it will be challenged. So poll workers were instructed to keep those ballots separate. Now, the last pile of ballots, which is unbelievable, my co-host Todd Bartley broke this story. He received from a whistleblower who was working at the polling stations. And we reported this the day before the election, by the way. They had received a list from the Department of State in Pennsylvania instructing poll workers how they were to count ballots. And one of the rules said something to this effect. I'm paraphrasing, but if you receive a ballot without a postmark or an illegible postmark, you are to count that ballot. Only if the preponderance of evidence suggests there's something fraudulent of the ballot should you discard it. So in other words, if a ballot came with a post envelope that didn't have a date on it, you still counted it. Those ballots were to be kept in a fourth pile. Because all of those files, the ones that were postmarked before Election Day but were returned afterwards, the ones whose signature didn't match, and the ones who didn't have a postmark, there were separate legal challenges for all three of those. They were all to be kept in separate piles. Because then you would say, okay, we've accepted the second pile, we accept the first pile, we accept the second pile. Those that were postdated before the election but were received afterwards. But the courts ruled the third and fourth pile, the ones whose signature doesn't match, and the one who didn't have a postmark can't be counted. Then we would know that those ones are be discarded and we count up the votes. Problem is, you ready for this? They didn't keep them separate. And to the extent that some places did, they threw away the envelopes. So now you just have to take their word. How would you know? Let's say you're a poll worker and you made a mistake. We won't even say fraud. It could be fraud, but maybe it's a mistake. And you accidentally put a bunch of the ones whose signatures didn't match in the pile saying they were good. How would you know now? The envelope's not there. How would you know the postmark if you threw the envelopes away? All they kept was the ballots. So now we have to take their word. Oh, no. These are the ones. That's when you heard the story of Samuel Alito, the Supreme Court Justice, ordering that these ballots be kept in separate piles because they weren't being. Right. Cybercamp says the Dems have fought voter ID the entire way. Of course. They don't want voter ID because it makes it easier to cheat. That's why it is. It's insulting to make claims that minorities can't acquire identification. It is ridiculous. It's insulting to them. Now, how much fraud and deception do we need to have? And I know what people say, but it's still not enough to flip. It's still not enough to flip. Again, for every instant that you catch, how many instances are out there that you didn't catch? That's the thing about cheating. Oftentimes, it's very hard to catch. Even in sports, when someone cheats, you probably catch them a very small minority of the time. But you know, if you caught them that one time, they were doing it other times. So how do we have faith in the system? Oh, it was only 3,000 dead people that voted. No big deal. Let me tell you another Pennsylvania-specific story that, again, we broke on my radio show with my co-hosts, Carlos Saldivia and Todd Bartley. This is all Todd's credit. He's the journalist. But he broke this story. This is a true story. You can go back and watch my 24-hour live stream, the Trump rally, the day before the election, and you can see us breaking this story. Todd received information that people, which this was known, people were receiving quarantine orders from the state of Pennsylvania. This had been occurring since April. And what these orders said were, if you were diagnosed with COVID, or if you were known to have been in contact with someone diagnosed with COVID, you were to quarantine yourself for 14 days in your home, basically not leave your home. If you violated that order, you could be forcibly quarantined in a hospital or medical facility. Not jail, but basically taken against your will, put in a hospital, and not allowed to leave. So in the effect, medical jail. Now, okay, people, not just COVID patients, but people that were in contact with COVID patients, thousands of these letters were going out ever since April. Now, the problem is, what happens over the 14-day period if Election Day falls within then? So let's just say you're an old man or woman. A friend of yours got diagnosed with COVID. You had contact with them. You receive a letter saying you're to quarantine yourself for 14 days. It's October 31st. You say, oh, well, I was going to vote November 3rd. I was going to go vote in person. What do you do? Now, you listening might say, well, I would try to contact someone and find out what the situation was. How many people would do that, though? How many people would just say, oh, I guess I can't vote. This says I'm not allowed to leave my house. It's too late to get an absentee ballot, so. How many thousands of people received that letter? And so, my co-host, Todd Bartley, asked the Secretary of Health, Monday, the day before the election, at 11:30, there was a press conference where they were going to talk about COVID. The press conference started with the Secretary of Health, Secretary Levine, saying, oh, tomorrow's a very magnanimous day. Go vote. Make sure you go vote. You know, it's a democracy. Have your voice heard. Now we're going to talk about COVID. So it's clear that they were thinking about COVID and the elections. That's what the Secretary of Health in Pennsylvania was thinking about. It comes to Todd's chance to ask a question. Again, my co-host, Todd Bartley. He says, people received these quarantine orders. Are they allowed to go vote in person if they've received these quarantine orders? If not, what is the process for them being able to vote? And the Secretary of Health basically said, we'll get back to you on that. This is the day before the election. Now, in their defense, 2 hours later, the Secretary of Health and the Health Department of Pennsylvania put up a press release that said this was what you were supposed to do. If you received one of those letters, you would contact your polling station to get an emergency ballot. Then the sheriff or a sheriff's deputy, they were the only people allowed, would pick up that emergency ballot and drive it to your home. The sheriff or the sheriff's deputy would then ensure that the ballot was proper, you were who you were saying you were, then you would take the ballot in your home and fill it out. You were then to hand it back to the sheriff or the sheriff's deputy, who would then, with only them being in the chain of custody, return it to the polling place. The problem was, how many people 10 hours before voting started do you think saw that press release? How many tens of thousands received a letter saying, basically, you can't leave your home to go vote, and then never saw the follow-up? Now, would it shock you to know that everybody knew that in-person voting the day of was massively going to favor Donald Trump? Would that shock you to know? So the fact that tens of thousands of people potentially received, and I don't have the specific number, how many people received the quarantine notices, but again, you can't just say, well, how many people were diagnosed with COVID? Because it's not just the people diagnosed. It was contact tracing. So they ask you when you're diagnosed, who are you around? Who do you work with? So everyone connected to you would get that letter. How many people didn't see the press release and then just said, oh, I'm not allowed to vote? In a close election in Pennsylvania where in-person voting was going to benefit Donald Trump. Now, is this evidence of fraud? Not necessarily. It could be gross incompetence. But notice how these things only go one way. Anytime we have gross incompetence or fraud, it's always against Trump and his supporters. Notice that? What's the rationale for this? Someone on the left, please tell me. I assume people on the left will say, well, this wasn't fraud. Okay. So explain to me how I'm supposed to put my health and the health of my family and all my loved ones here in Pennsylvania with the person in charge, Health Secretary Levine, didn't even think until a journalist asked her, oh, geez, we're telling people they can't leave their homes. Maybe we ought to tell them how they could vote. They didn't think of that. But that's the person I'm supposed to put my health in their hands. By the way, the same lady who removed her mother from a nursing home told us all that nursing homes would be safe and then promptly put COVID patients in nursing homes, causing tens of thousands of deaths. That same lady. But we're supposed to trust them. Blind trust in the system. How many coincidences are we going to see before someone says, yeah, okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here? Like Pfizer. We know that Pfizer, from their own evidence suggesting how many tests they did, they only had to do 60 to get approved for a vaccine. They did 92. They knew well before they released the information that they had a potentially workable vaccine. They knew well before then that that was the case. Yet, they didn't say. Why? Because no one wanted Trump to get credit that there was a possible vaccine coming out, just like he was saying before the election. Horrible. Instead, the media and the Democrats said, it's impossible. That'll never happen. Calling Arizona with 1% of the vote in, or whatever it was. We're still not sure who's going to win Arizona. It's likely to be within a margin of a couple thousand votes. And Fox and the AP called it before they called Texas and Florida. We have a mainstream media that reported every salacious piece of garbage about Trump and Russia. P-tapes and leaks every week about, we have evidence that he colluded with Russia. And there was never any evidence. None. But they reported it every day for 4 years. But when a business partner of Hunter Biden comes out and says, here's the business arrangement that Joe and Hunter Biden were involved in that's shady, here's documents to prove that's the case, at least documents worth investigating, and almost the entirety of the mainstream media goes, no, we're not going to cover this. Nope. Tech companies censor the New York Post, the oldest newspaper in the country, censor them for reporting on this story. An FBI that spied on a president using unverified opposition research paid by his opponent. Sourced using a known Russian spy that the FBI never verified and then used to spy on Donald Trump's campaign. All of this stuff going in one direction. And we're supposed to, hey, you have to trust the system. The Democrats for 4 years told us that Russia stole the election. I've seen polls that suggest 30 to 40% of Democratic voters still to this day think that Russians hacked voting machines in 2016. But those people that refuse to accept the results of the 2016 election are now telling you, yes, of course dead people voted, and we said that it couldn't happen. Of course not, but still, shut your mouth. Did I have my coffee today? I usually don't drink coffee. I had some there that 24-hour stream, but... Now, we've gone through mathematics, right? The mathematical formulas that are, for example, the math that I was looking at was showing the rate of Democrat to Republican ballots, how it inexplicably switched from the straight line pattern that we saw in every state. It switched every single time to benefit Biden, only in the swing states, which is an incredible anomaly. We saw that polling stations only in these Democratic strongholds in swing states decided arbitrarily to stop counting votes in the middle of the night. And then, once you went to bed, they were like, yeah, we're done for the night. All of a sudden, between 4 and 6 a.m., all of them found hundreds of thousands of ballots, almost all of which went for Joe Biden. And we're supposed to just, oh, okay, no problem there. Why'd you stop counting? We felt like it. We're supposed to ignore the fact the Republican poll watchers were kept out of places like Philly and other places. Literally, you could see, this isn't even a conspiracy. I think it was in Nevada. You could see them boarding up the glass around where they were counting the polls because they didn't want people to see them. In Philadelphia, when a judge then ordered the poll watchers from the Republicans to be allowed to be within 6 feet to accurately watch the polls, what did the Democrats do? Stop counting. We're going to take it to court. We're going to fight this. They refused to properly segregate the ballots based on different types like they were ordered to because they knew there would be court challenges. Refused. Now we just have to take their word. We don't get to see the postmarks anymore. Those envelopes aren't attached to the ballots. So we just have to take their word. What good's a recount in that world? One second here. Sorry, I don't have enough mods, so. And sadly, many on the left don't care. Orange man bad, they don't care. They don't care. They were fine with the coup from the FBI, didn't care. Fine with the media being totally in the tank with Biden, didn't care. Fine with the fact that tech companies were censoring conservatives, didn't care. Fine with the fact that dead people were voting, don't care. As long as Orange Man Bad gets out of there, that's all that matters. That's how they view things. If they're willing to use violence against Trump supporters, you don't think they're willing to cheat at the ballot box? If they're willing to send COVID patients into nursing homes causing tens of thousands of deaths, you think they're unwilling to cheat at the ballot box? And if you're on the left and you're saying, but why can't you just accept the election? Why would we? Why didn't you just accept the election in 2016? Maybe not you personally, but your side. Is he irrational? Why was that okay? Where were all these magnanimous leftists? Oh, it's time to come together. It's time to have unity. When Trump won 2016. Oh, we have to accept these results. Clearly, this is what the will of the American people. Where were all of you? I see you popping up now all of a sudden on my channel and on Twitter and a bunch of other conservative places. You're very magnanimous. Where were you for 4 years? Couldn't find you. Don't recall you telling the left, hey, you got to accept the results. Stop with all this Russia crap. It's garbage. Nope. And by the way, why is there more vitriol put to people like me from a lot of these people who has no power whatsoever, just a random guy with a small channel? I might be devilishly handsome and quite articulate, but I don't have any institutional power. So what's the difference? If I don't accept the results of the election, what's the harm? Worst case scenario, I'm wrong. I've convinced a bunch of people that are also now wrong. And versus the Democrats and Hillary Clinton, who used the FBI to spy on their opponent based on their unwillingness to accept the results of the election. Now, which one did more real-world harm to this country? And yet, as always, no one cared. The same leftists that are now saying, we got to come together. We have to accept the results of the election. They didn't say a word then. They didn't say a word for 4 years. They didn't say, stop the special counsel. Stop these investigations. This is politically motivated because they refused to accept the results of the 2016 election. They didn't say any of that. They were fine with those. Orange man bad. Do whatever you can to make his life miserable. Hopefully get him out of office. Hopefully stop his agenda from being put forth because of these constant investigations. They were totally fine with that. That sort of being unwilling to accept the results of the election, no problem. But you just have to believe all these voting, dead people voting, you have to shut up and accept it. You have to. All the other anomalies and evidence of potential fraud we see, you just have to ignore it. It's time to come together. Yes, we called you racist Nazis for 4 years. Yes, we did that. We said you were the worst people. But now let's come together. Come on, let's come together now. All right. Yesterday I did a show talking more hypocrisy, and one of the big themes was this whistleblower. This whistleblower from the United States Postal Service in Erie claims to have heard supervisors talking about intentionally backdating ballots so that they would be accepted. In other words, these are ballots that were postmarked after the election. And yet they were saying to postmark them before the election so that they would be counted. And they had special procedures in how to count these ballots because of that. And he was shocked to see those procedures continued after the election for ballots that were dated after the election. So he blew the whistle. He's a whistleblower. The Washington Post said that he recanted his story. He said that's not true. What he did was he wore an audio device and recorded the entire interview with the investigator from the United States Postal Service. I do not have access to that tape. However, what I do have is access to someone who's worked in interrogation and with federal law enforcement who did have access to that tape. He put out an entire Twitter thread about the problems with this interrogation of this whistleblower. Now, the reason this is relevant is this. There are many people claiming to be whistleblowers that they saw evidence of fraud. All of them could be telling the truth. All of them could be lying. It's probably somewhere in between. Some of them are probably truthful. Some of them are lying. I don't know. So it's hard to evaluate their specific claims. However, the same could be said of the whistleblower that blew the whistle on the Ukrainian impeachment, which was just another aspect of the coup attempt against Trump. A whistleblower that we now know most likely was meeting with Adam Schiff, planning people like Alexander Vindman, planning out how to take Trump down. Not because he was blowing the whistle, but because he had a political axe to grind. But we were told that was sacrosanct. The whistleblower must be protected at all costs. Whistleblowers are the backbone of this country. We have to protect them. So much so, you can't even say the whistleblower's name. Oh my goodness, if his details were outed, think of the trouble he'd go. He needs to be treated with respect and dignity. That's what whistleblowers are. That's what the left told us, remember? That's what the media told us. That's what the Democrats told us. So surely then, if we could prove that this whistleblower in this case, even if you think that he's mistaken or he's not telling the truth, shouldn't he be treated with the same reverence that we treated the whistleblower in the Ukraine situation? So why then, when he's being interviewed, remember, you're an investigator from the United States Postal Service. You just heard an incredibly shocking allegation that your organization was involved in election fraud, intentionally. Wouldn't you want to get to the bottom of that? Sure, you want to make sure the story's true, but are you going to treat the whistleblower as hostile and use interrogation tactics on him? I don't think so. I think that the same left would have been furious if that's the way the whistleblower was treated in the Ukraine situation. So this is a very, very long thread that I think's worth reading from someone who listened to the entire 2-hour, 15-minute audio tape. Because again, the whistleblower wore an audio device in while he was being interviewed, which ended up being an interrogation. So this person's going to tell you all of the problems that happened with that interrogation. One second. Do I have any mods in here? One second. All right. So let's go. Sorry about that. I didn't have a mod, so I had to do it myself. Let's see if I can find this. All right, I warn you this is long, but I think it's worth going through. So what I'll be reading is someone with intimate knowledge of interrogation techniques used by intelligence officers who had access to the 2-hour tape of this whistleblower as he was being interviewed by the United States Postal Service Inspector General. So for those on the podcast, I will be reading this out loud. The Hopkins case. Hopkins is the whistleblower. During the interview, he was advised of his garrity rights. This is the version of Miranda rights that applies to public employees. It was done as a voluntary statement, meaning the government can use it for either for criminal or administrative punishment purposes. At a certain point in the tape, the transcript says guarantee rights. That's a transcript error because these folks don't know what garrity rights are. The agent is telling him it's his garrity rights, not guaranteed rights. What's not on the tape is any description of what Hopkins was told about whether the interview was voluntary or mandatory, compelled, or what the purpose of the interview was, whether he sought them out to provide a statement or whether they asked for one. Those facts would be important to know to fully evaluate whether he had enough information to truly make a voluntary statement. I'm continuing to listen, so I'll be back later, but I wanted to start this thread and explain about the warning's rights as soon as I got to that part, since it's an important question where people are already focused on. I'm halfway through this interview, and there's a lot wrong with it. I have to keep stopping it to walk a lap around my house because it's seriously problematic. This interview gets worse and worse. I'm on minute 122, and when I'm done listening to it, I'm going to point out a number of serious problems with it. What they have done to this guy is really wrong. It illustrates a number of common problems with federal investigations. Finished. It's hard to convey how really problematic this interview is. There are some positive details, which I'll point those out. But mostly this interview is an example of investigating in a way that is not a search for the truth and is illustrative of investigative bias and abuse. So think about that for a second. You're the United States Postal Service, one of the biggest cases that your investigator will ever have. Allegations that your agency was engaged in fraud to help Joe Biden win an election, to steal an election. You think you would approach that very seriously. Instead, as this person points out, it's not that they're looking for the truth. They have bias, and instead of looking for the truth, they're trying to get this man to recant his statement. See you, Cybercamp. Thanks. So sorry, this is going to be long. Again, I apologize. But let's proceed. It's also crystal clear that Hopkins, again the whistleblower, was overborne by investigative techniques. I'll show how with several examples. Further, there was some completely inappropriate conduct by the investigating agent. To hit the big issue first, there is no recantation in this interview. To the contrary, even having psychological techniques used on him doesn't keep Hopkins from continuing to tell agents that they thinks that there was a significant problem in how ballots were handled. Now, this is going to be a key part because remember, immediately following this interview, someone from the USPS investigative agency released to the Washington Post that Hopkins totally recanted his claims that there was potential election fraud. That's not true. That's not what happened. They used interrogation techniques to try to force that, but even at the end of the day, he never recants. So the Washington Post story is a lie. Continuing. This is again Leslie McAdoo Gordon on Twitter. He never says the original facts in his affidavit were false or it did not happen. The very most he says is that there's possible he may have misunderstood or made assumptions. This is definitely not a recantation. He's allowing allowances for the possibility that he might be mistaken. That is the sign of someone who is telling the truth, not someone who is lying. Honest people concede when they could be wrong, even if they don't think they are. Even the agents tell him repeatedly that they believe what he's saying, and although that can be investigative technique also, it is clear they mean it here. They did several things to support that. They could have pushed him to say the original statement was a lie or was motivated by revenge, etc., which they mentioned, but they don't. It's actually pretty easy to make someone look like a liar even when they aren't, and they didn't try to do that here. Even in the changes to the affidavit that they gave him to make the emphasize that he was acting in good faith and with a sense of duty, they wouldn't have bothered with that if they thought he was lying. They were trying to make sure he had some cover for making the allegations. Agents can be funny that way. If they think the guy's dirty, they want him to confess it, put it in his statement. But they want to play fair by their lights and not have the guy confess to stuff they don't think that he did. And that brings us to one of the big problems here. The interview wasn't conducted as a legitimate search for facts and truth. It was conducted from the beginning, from the conclusion that Hopkins was wrong, and the agent's job was to figure out if he was lying or if he was mistaken. They decided he was a good guy who meant well, but was mistaken. Of course, that predetermined conclusion may or may not be true. And there's no problem with pushing a witness to probe the accuracy and strength of the witness information and recollection. But starting from a conclusion distorts that process. Before I get into some of the specific techniques, let me give you a few data points about investigation. Competent agents are allowed to lie to people about the facts of the case and the evidence as a form of investigative technique. They cannot legally lie about just anything. Also, they cannot make promises to the person being interrogated. More correctly, they can, but doing so undermines the voluntary nature of the interview and can make it useless for legal purposes. Obviously, they can't use actual physical force, which didn't happen here. Also, certain kinds of other acts are also not legal. Things like depriving people of sleep or water. That de facto amount to physical coercion. But that leaves many kinds of psychological techniques available that are, quote, legal. The problem is you can, in fact, easily coerce people with techniques that are way less offensive than depriving them of food or water. These techniques are commonly used in federal investigations, especially if no lawyer's present. A major problem with these techniques is they produce false answers rather than truthful ones because the person is responding to the techniques rather than retrieving correct information. But agents believe they are getting, quote, the truth, which they think they already know. Many of these techniques were used in this interview. Strasser, who is the investigator that's interviewing the whistleblower Hopkins, Strasser bullied Hopkins for about the first 30 minutes or so, establishing control, not letting Hopkins talk, cutting him off, not letting him explain, getting him to give assent to things Strasser said. Strasser's a polygrapher. My experience of nearly 30 years with government polygraphers is there's two kinds. One, skilled, they could get to the truth, which is a minority of them. And second, disastrous. They know the techniques, but you're getting nowhere near the truth. The second kind is a bully. Strasser bullied Hopkins here, but he did so subtly. By the end, Hopkins thought Strasser was his friend, even though he talked Hopkins into disavowing an affidavit containing facts that Hopkins never substantially repudiated. Strasser would likely deny he bullied Hopkins. He would say he was helping him get the truth out. But objectively speaking, that is not what happened in this interview. One proof is Hopkins, even at the end, is telling them he believed the way ballots were handled was wrong. One thing that Strasser does that is inappropriate is he repeatedly tells Hopkins that he is there to, quote, protect Hopkins. That is a lie. He reassures Hopkins of it many, many times in various formulations during the interview to make Hopkins believe it's true, but it's not. Strasser does a number of other things during the interview to keep control of Hopkins. An example, he makes a show of asking if Hopkins is all right as they go along. He made a big deal at the beginning of the interview about Hopkins' right to leave and be comfortable. But as the interview progresses and Hopkins gets distressed a few times and Strasser is closing in on his kill shot to get Hopkins to disavow the affidavit, Strasser switches the language he's using. He started by asking open questions like, "Are you okay? Are you doing all right?" About 2/3 of the way through, it changes. Strasser has established control from the beginning. Now, when Hopkins gets upset because he's being coerced, Strasser makes a show of concern but says, "Tell me you're okay." Sometimes he even repeats it twice. He's not asking, he's telling. If he asks Hopkins an open question such as, "Are you okay?" Hopkins might say no. He might say, "I want to stop." So Strasser doesn't ask it that way. He asks for confirmation that Hopkins is okay. "Tell me you're okay." That's a statement. Hopkins hesitates a couple times, but ultimately agrees. Strasser's maintaining control this way. He wants Hopkins to think if he cares if Hopkins is okay, when in fact, he really doesn't want Hopkins to communicate to Hopkins that something is wrong, which it is, because Hopkins might call a halt to things if he gets upset. Another way Strasser controls Hopkins is with the break that they take. At the beginning, he tells Hopkins he can take a break if he needs to. Hopkins says he's a smoker and will want to take a break at some point. When the break comes, though, Strasser convinces Hopkins it would be better if someone went with him, supposedly because Hopkins might face harassment. How exactly would he realistically face harassment at a USPS facility where he works and where management knows he's a whistleblower? Even worse, Strasser imposes a condition on Hopkins for permission to take his supposedly completely free break through controlling his behavior on the break in a way that advantages the interrogation but disadvantages Hopkins. First, he asks Hopkins if he'll agree not to speak to anyone about the interview during the break. What happened to Hopkins can talk or not talk as he chooses and could have a lawyer if he wants one, which Strasser advised him in the first half hour. Hopkins agrees to not talk to anyone during the break, and Strasser doubles down to exert further control to make sure he doesn't. Strasser says he'll allow the break if Hopkins agrees not to talk to anyone else during the break. He's converted it into Hopkins needs his permission. Hopkins agrees again, a reinforcing promise, not to talk to anyone during the smoke break, and a second agent accompanies him on the break and makes small talk with him while he smokes. Mission accomplished. Hopkins didn't talk to anyone during the break. Strasser employed another technique to break down what he knew would be Hopkins' resistance to disavowing his affidavit. Hopkins was 5 years in the Marine Corps and 4 in the Army Guard. He's not the kind of guy who's going to easily disavow a sworn statement he signed. But he will disavow if Strasser can convince him that there's something legitimately wrong with the affidavit. And that affidavit is bad for the USPS. It says Hopkins overheard supervisors talking about backdating ballots received after the legal deadline. But Strasser has concluded that Hopkins is a nice guy who misunderstood so he wants him to disavow the affidavit, but to do it in a way that doesn't completely, excuse the language, fuck over Hopkins, because he's a nice guy that way. So he asked Hopkins about his relationship with Project Veritas. And this person, Leslie Gordon, that I'm reading from, says, disclaimer, I'm agnostic on Project Veritas. Hopkins explains how Veritas has had his back because they've been helping him navigate the craziness caused by his allegations. Hopkins is worried, rightfully, about losing his job in retaliation for bringing forward this allegation that he honestly believed was problematic and needed to be investigated. Veritas has been helping him keep calm. It also showed him how to set up a GoFundMe in case he gets fired. Hopkins is a believer in Veritas because from his point of view, they're shielding him from the media and helping him contingency plan for if he gets fired, and they have lawyers lined up if he needs one. His faith in Veritas is not what Strasser, the investigator, wants to hear, because he wants Hopkins to disavow that affidavit or at least amend it and give a written statement that while he had a basis for being concerned, he doesn't actually have proof of misconduct he's alleging. So Strasser, being a logical guy, attacks Veritas to undermine it in Hopkins' eyes. He gets Hopkins to agree that the affidavit is written by a lawyer working with Veritas, not his lawyer. That sounds bad, except there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and lawyers do it every day. The issue with affidavits is whether or not the facts are true. Lawyers routinely take affidavits from people who are not their clients as part of building a case. Just because the lawyer isn't yours doesn't mean that the lawyer is taking down what you said accurately or fairly. That depends entirely on the course on the lawyer. But the suggestion sows a deep seed of doubt in Hopkins' mind. Strasser returns a number of times during this part of the interview to the idea that Veritas may not have Hopkins' interest at heart. He doesn't necessarily say why, though. At first, it's just a suggestion, but by the end, it's a full-on Veritas is using him, whereas his good friend Strasser's there to help and protect him. He literally says he's not going to let the USPS challenge Hopkins' integrity because he, Strasser, knows that Hopkins is an honest man. Strasser really goes completely over the line in this section of the interview, though. He starts giving Hopkins advice. He gives him advice on what to do in his relationship with Veritas. Strasser is an agent of the USPS. He cannot advise Hopkins about diddly squat, but he does so repeatedly. It's probably fair game that Strasser asks about the affidavit and Veritas' role in it. It's the basis for Hopkins' claim. But Strasser also presses on the GoFundMe account, which has nothing to do with Hopkins' ballot backdating allegation, actually. Why is the USPS OIG asking about that? They aren't the FBI, and there's nothing illegal about that GoFundMe account. But Strasser isn't worried about jurisdiction because he's not actually asking to probe the legality of that account. He's asking as another tactic to undermine Hopkins' faith in Veritas. He makes a vague assertion that he never returns to getting Hopkins to agree he made assumptions, that if Hopkins' claim was based on an assumption rather than hard facts, that it might create legal problems with the GoFundMe account. This isn't remotely true. This does have the desired effect of making Hopkins start to wonder if he has a legal problem with the GoFundMe account, which he does not, but now he is worried he might. Next, Strasser gets Hopkins to agree that even though Veritas helped Hopkins set up the GoFundMe, all the money will go to Hopkins. Hopkins agrees. He thinks that's a good thing, which it is. If any of the money went to Veritas, at a minimum, people might say they were misleading. There's nothing wrong with Veritas teaching Hopkins how to set up a GoFundMe, so Hopkins feeling good about that. Then Strasser flips it on him. He implies and then outright says he's worried Veritas wants it to be set up in a way so if anything goes wrong, Hopkins is the person holding the bag. This is a complete distortion of the applicable rules and has zero relevance to Strasser's actual investigation. But that's not why he's talking about it. He's using it to cause Hopkins to doubt Veritas and to trust Strasser. It's a body blow for later when Strasser attacks the affidavit. There's a lot more wrong with this interview, and I'm not going to hit everything. But before we get to the facts of the affidavit, let me address two other issues. First, as I said, most of these techniques are legal, but that doesn't keep them from distorting the truth-seeking process. They do. Let me pause here. This is Rob speaking again, not reading from this. So now, again, here's the problem. What people defending these techniques will say was, well, that's legal. It's legal interrogation techniques. So if it's legal, what's the problem? The problem is the same people telling you that were the ones that said we have to treat whistleblowers as sacrosanct. They're the greatest people. We can't impugn them in any... Oh, they need to be treated with absolute delicacy. Now all of a sudden, there's no problem with the way they're going after this whistleblower. Why is that? Why is it okay that they're setting it up as if they know the facts and they're attacking this person? Are you lying or are you mistaken? Maybe he's telling the truth and he's not mistaken. A good investigator would be open to that possibility, but it's clear that's not the case here. Why? Because they don't want that to be the truth. So let's continue now. Second, and this is, again, Leslie McAdoo Gordon. It's at MC, or capital MC, capital ADOO, capital GORDON, McAdoo Gordon. Continuing. Second, people are wondering why he does not have a lawyer or union rep with him. So let me talk about those for a second. You have to invoke your right to have a union rep president. Management does not advise you of that right or independently provide the rep. For lawyers, the kind of investigation makes a difference. In a criminal investigation, you have a right to a lawyer. For most public jobs, Fed agencies, in an administrative interview, you don't have the right to have a lawyer. Some agencies allow it by regulation or agree as a courtesy. The USPS OIG does not have jurisdiction to investigate crimes. The U.S. Postal Inspection Service does. This interview was a mixed interview for criminal and administrative purposes. They told Hopkins that, although they did not tell him in the tape what administrative meant. However, even an OIG investigation interview that can lead to criminal charges and statements, given the OIG can be used in a criminal investigation and prosecution of someone if the statement they gave is voluntary, that is, not compelled. You can agree to give a voluntary statement during a criminal investigation, but most of the time you shouldn't. If you refuse to give a voluntary statement, the agency can compel you. That's why it's called a compelled statement. But then it cannot be used in a criminal case. So depending upon exactly what kind of investigation the Postal Inspection Service is conducting in this case, Hopkins may or may not have had the right to have a lawyer in the interview. For the OIG case, it would depend on the regulations and the terms and the collective bargaining agreement. If Hopkins didn't ask too many or any questions about his rights to counsel, most agents would happily let you sign a waiver to give a completely voluntary statement, and then the government can do whatever it wants with your statement. The fact the waiver advise of rights they gave Hopkins discusses potential criminal use of any statements he makes, and the fact that the agents call them garrity rights indicates he almost certainly had a right to have a lawyer there with him, but might not have known that. Having a lawyer there would have eliminated or limited the abusive techniques used by Strasser. But take note that in most circumstances, employees in compelled interviews can't have a lawyer there, so they have to grapple with these abusive techniques alone or with only a union rep. Because so many investigative scenarios involving employees, including some security interviews, can subject employees to criminal prosecution, I think Congress should create a right to counsel for them, which I totally agree with. The current system is rampant with abuse and not conducive to truth. Strasser made it clear to Hopkins at the beginning that he doubted Hopkins' version of events. He made him do a, quote, field trip to see if the distance from where he was standing and the others were speaking would have allowed Hopkins to hear them. He told Hopkins at one point he was going to be challenging Hopkins' version as true, but he let that lie. Also early in the interview, he mentioned the possibility of a polygraph, but he also let that lie there until the end. Both of these were to make Hopkins aware he might not be believed. Later, after Strasser had himself concluded that Hopkins was not lying, but was just mistaken, he began telling Hopkins repeatedly that he believed him. This was both true and a technique. It persuaded Hopkins that Strasser would help him be believed when it came to amending the affidavit. Almost none of this 2-hour interview was about the actual factual information Hopkins knew. A legitimate witness interview would have started with background questions about the person, leading around to asking for the witness to tell his story. Here it didn't happen that way. After a quick touch on it in the field trip, Strasser spent a lot of time on all the stuff I've discussed before, finally focusing on the specifics of what happened. That was all to soften Hopkins up and establish control. When he asked, Hopkins relayed the facts in his affidavit. Strasser then set about challenging his narrative. Okay, which he should have. His job is to get to the bottom of the situation and establish what Hopkins was alleging through the interview. He starts out okay, asking Hopkins to say the exact words he heard. He's trying to get beyond the general allegation to the specifics of the facts. This is a theme Strasser also developed during the interview. He kept telling Hopkins he wanted to reduce it down to just the facts. In substance, Hopkins says he was working on the 5th, and he overheard a nearby conversation between 2 supervisors, talking about ballots from the 4th being dated for the 3rd, except one that was accurately postmarked for the 4th. He was concerned about that and approached the speakers, one of whom turned his head and looked at him, and they both walked off. He interpreted what they said to be backdating postmarks on ballots. He told another employee about the conversation before they went in their routes. He described how another employee, a female, had been instructing the carriers to be sure to gather up ballots when on their routes and give them to the supervisor promptly on their return prior to the election on November 3rd. He thought there was nothing wrong with this practice. He understood that those ballots prior to the election were being gathered separately in order to send them to county officials to be counted in the election. This was apparently instead of going through the usual longer route to be postmarked and sent back through Erie. What he didn't understand is why this practice of collecting them continued after Election Day. You sort of have to infer from the jargon they are using, but it seems that all 3 agree they are discussing non-postmarked ballots here. So Hopkins doesn't understand why the office is continuing to collect non-postmarked ballots in a special way after Election Day. He was off the 4th. When he hears this snippet of conversation on the 5th, he thought they were discussing backdated ballots received on the 4th. Strasser gets Hopkins to agree with the non-controversial proposition that Hopkins could have had the same words he says he heard, but they could be talking about something else. Strasser asks if that's possible. No sane person is going to agree with that. Hopkins agrees it could be possible. Strasser also introduces the idea that Hopkins made a logical assumption to reach the conclusion that supervisors were discussing backdating, even though they didn't literally use the word. Hopkins agrees with this because he's not a crazy person. They go over the conversation again, and later in the interview, when Hopkins is talking about it, he adopts the language that he was making as an assumption of what they meant because he's already conceded that point. He's being agreeable. Strasser seizes on that and reinforces it. This is how false information often creeps into interviews. People are predisposed to be agreeable. They don't like conflict. They want to be reasonable. Hopkins doesn't think he's disagreeing with his affidavit about what he heard and what it meant. He knows what he heard. He's just agreeing that he isn't infallible and that it's possible he misunderstood or misinterpreted what he heard. He tells them several times that he came forward precisely so the USPS would investigate and figure it out. But now that he's conceded that he made an assumption about what he heard, Strasser actually pressures him to agree that he doesn't have firsthand knowledge of the allegation. This is, excuse the language, but fucking crazy. He does have firsthand information. He overheard them talking. He saw how the ballots were being handled. He may be wrong in his understanding or interpretation of what it means, but he absolutely has firsthand information to support his allegation, and he thought they were backdating the ballots. Being wrong about the facts has zero to do with whether or not you have firsthand knowledge of those facts. But Strasser's assertion leads Hopkins to start to say he only has, quote, hearsay info, and backpedaling because now he isn't sure anymore, but not because he doesn't know what he heard. And the other agents say it isn't even hearsay. I'll give them that. It's not hearsay. It's direct evidence of a statement in support of a conspiracy and observation of steps to carry out the conspiracy. That's the evidentiary quality of the info. The issue is Hopkins mistaken? Because if he's mistaken, there's no conspiracy, and what he has is firsthand knowledge of something that he just misunderstood. But conveying to him that the quality of evidence was less than it really is led Hopkins to further doubt himself. Having convinced Hopkins that perhaps he didn't hear what he thought he heard, Strasser then attacks the affidavit, which contains Hopkins' original statement of facts, as he believed them to be at the time he signed the affidavit. Take note that at this point in the interview, Hopkins has not repudiated a single one of the facts in the affidavit, or that he's previously provided in the interview. He has simply agreed that the situation might not, in fact, be what he was worried that it was. But he is now very worried, you could hear it in his voice, that he has made a false allegation without meaning to it. That is entirely because the interviewers have spent the entire interview giving him reasons to doubt himself. He even says he would feel bad if that's what happened. Except again, he's not saying that anything he put in the affidavit or that he's told them in the interview did not happen, or that he lied. Strasser accuses him of exaggerating, but it's obvious that Hopkins doesn't think he did that. He's just worried that he made a mistake. So Strasser turns to the affidavit and reads paragraph 3. When Strasser reads it, Hopkins really reacts because he sees how clear it states the claims, and now he thinks he was making assumptions that may not be correct, and he thinks he'll be in big trouble even though he believed it was true when he signed it and when he began the interview. And we know for sure that Hopkins believed the claim was true when he signed the affidavit because, one, even at this point, he has not contradicted any of the facts in paragraph 3. He just doubts his interpretation of them. And also because, two, right after he heard the conversation that concerned him, he discussed it with a coworker and told her that what he'd heard and his interpretation of it, and they discussed what he should do about it also. Because, three, the same day he heard the conversation, November 5th, he collected a ballot on his route and he followed the policy that bothered him, and he put it in a separate spot, but he hand wrote 11/5/20 in small writing on the back of the document that was there. That was the day he actually received it. There is absolutely no way he would have dated that ballot if he had not actually believed the conversation he heard was about backdating ballots. Even if it did not contain the words postmarked or date, that is obviously what he thought the supervisors were discussing. He might have been completely mistaken about that, but that does not make his affidavit or allegation false. But he got persuaded because of all the technique that was used on him from the interviewers to believe otherwise. So at that point in the interview, he is motivated to disavow an affidavit he has not contradicted and to have Strasser save him from being, quote, fucked, as Strasser was putting it. So he's willing to do whatever Strasser, who keeps telling him that he's there to protect him, advises. Strasser has him add stuff about bringing the claim because he thought it was his duty, which all of them seem to actually believe, and to add in two places that he made, quote, logical assumptions to reach the conclusions to drawn in the affidavit. Strasser focuses on the language in the affidavit where Hopkins signed under penalty of perjury. He is relieved to see the language states Hopkins believed the facts of the affidavit to be true. This is the tell that Strasser thinks the same thing I do. Hopkins believed the facts in the affidavit, which were true when he signed it. If that's so, it would basically be impossible to prosecute him for a false statement. They do change a few small things. For example, paragraph 3 said that the supervisor gave the instruction. Actually, it was literally his assistant. Hopkins concedes this, but they even add language to say the course of the postmaster is the boss. None of the changes are a, quote, recantation. The part of the tape where they're actually working through the affidavit is pretty gross. Strasser is literally telling him what to say and write. He'd say things like, quote, I'd rather say XX. At that point, he's completely in control of Hopkins, and the agents basically dictate what he should say. Hopkins is agreeing with them as they go, of course, because he's in full give them what they want mode. He does balk a few times when they want him to say something he really knows to really not be correct. So he negotiates with them. After all the technique he used on him, I'm actually impressed he balked at the end. He gave them what they'd persuaded him of him, but not the things he knew were incorrect, and he kept bringing up that he thinks collecting the non-postmarked ballots after the election was an issue. Hopkins had kept hidden for almost the entire interview that he was wearing a recording device to record the interview, but he gives that up at the end because they persuaded him that Veritas is not working in his best interest, but they are. It shows how well coercion has worked. Because having that recording is the only proof he was going to have these agents conduct in this interview in a completely inappropriate manner, and that he never disavowed the actual substantive facts of his affidavit, only agreed that he may be mistaken about the situation. Unbelievably, after he discloses the recording, Strasser tells him the agency may or may not allow him to keep it. I don't think so. They had no basis whatsoever for controlling that. I suppose there's an argument it's an agency record, but the better argument is it's personal to him. Also, at one point toward the end, Strasser says something about doing things in a way so that people won't think Hopkins was being coerced. This is completely laughable. Almost the entire interview is psychological coercion. Whether that's misdirection by Strasser to try to persuade Hopkins he wasn't coerced, or whether Strasser is so immersed in it culturally that he can't see it, is hard to tell. I do know there were a lot of instances in this interview where Strasser said things that are the exact opposite of what he was actually doing at the time. You could hear it in his voice sometimes too. He knows he's lying. That's the interviewer, Strasser again. The interview continued for about an hour after Hopkins told him he was recording them. During that hour, they had him write a statement. I have no doubt it was equally coercive as the affidavit changes were. But without the recording, it won't be clear-cut as the affidavit. Another thing that happens when someone's been coerced in this way is once they are removed from the coercive environment, they promptly deny that they recanted, and they revert back to their original narrative. It shows that the change was in response to the techniques and not the truth. For sure, Hopkins needs to get counsel ASAP. He's going to be involved for legal proceedings for a while, I think. Some have asked what I would have done if I'd have been his counsel. Each case is unique, but operates within a legal framework. For sure, I would have demanded to know his status, witness, subject, or target before agreeing to an interview. Depending on the answer you get, the strategy is different. But a good lawyer would have prepped him for an interview and what to watch out for if you agreed to an interview or got forced into a compelled interview. Also, even in a compelled interview, some things are off limits. When I'm in the room with a client during an interview, though, a lot of these techniques never show up. Funny how that is. Also, the end. Oh, then he says, P.S. I want to correct my tweet about the OIG not having any criminal jurisdiction. I stated that more categorically than I meant. They do, but it's limited. They aren't the FBI, general crime fighting. In that tweet, I correctly said this case is a mix between criminal and administrative. PSS. One thing I forgot to mention that I thought was hilarious is that when they finally got to the affidavit, Hopkins says, so you want me to fix my affidavit? And the long silence from the agents was deafening. I laughed out loud at that because he sounded dubious, and I think they weren't sure whether he meant fix it as incorrect or as in fraudulently alter. They're both sitting there wondering if he was playing them all along. Boy, I laughed at that. That's it. Now, I wasn't, I didn't have that actually. Here it is. I'll put the link to this tweet, but you can see that I was reading all of that. Apologize that I didn't have that up on screen. Big dummy, Rob. Now, this is something the left knows. Again, there's television shows you can go on Netflix, entire seasons of police using abusive interrogation techniques to get false admissions out of people. We know that if you use these techniques, you could coerce even the strongest of people to question themselves and to alter their testimony. So the point I'm making, I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you as much as the person that I just read, all of the legal jargon involving this stuff. But what I can tell you is this. It is clear, if this person's accurate and heard the tape, which by all accounts it seems that he did, it is clear that they treated this whistleblower as hostile. They said, we don't believe him. We're going to prove that he's wrong or that he's lying. That is not how the left told us we should treat whistleblowers. The idea that he recanted is laughable. Basically, he heard what he heard, and they're just saying, well, could that theoretically have meant something different? I suppose, but who couldn't say that about anything you hear? Anytime you walk in and hear a portion of a conversation, you could literally hear someone say, I murdered my wife and buried her in the backyard. You heard that, then you found out the lady's dead. You report it. You say, I heard the guy say he murdered his wife and buried her in the backyard. Investigators could say, could he theoretically have been talking about a video game? Yes, theoretically that's possible. Okay. So can you sign this affidavit, or can you alter your affidavit to say you made assumptions? We all make assumptions in everything that we hear. That doesn't prove that his original statement was inaccurate. That is not recanting, as the Washington Post said. And to me, the most damning thing is he told a coworker that he had a problem with it. And then he went out and collects ballots on the 5th and was told to keep collecting these ballots, which he thought there was a problem if they weren't postmarked. And he wrote the actual date as a sign of like, look, I just want to make sure that the people counting these ballots know this was the date it was received, even though he was instructed to pick it up and he wasn't told that he had to put dates on it. So it's clear that he thought there was a problem. Now, what good investigators would do was to take his accusation seriously and then go to the people that are alleged to have behaved in the misconduct and interview them with at least the same amount of zeal that they went after the whistleblower. Imagine that a crime's committed. Imagine that you're a rape victim and you go in and you say, look, I'm a victim, and they treat you like crap. But when it comes to the alleged rapist, they treat with a soft hand. Is that the system we want? The person making the accusation of possible corruption is treated like a criminal. Is that that's the system you want to live in? Why would this occur? If it's true that he was just mistaken, why would they attack him like this? Yeah, he was grilled harder than Hunter Biden. True that. So I missed a lot of comments there because I was reading. I do apologize that that was long. But that's the point I wanted to get. Again, another double standard that you see here. Where are all the people not? Where's the ACLU? Where are all the people that talk about, we couldn't even know the whistleblower's name in the impeachment saga. Couldn't even know his name. He had to be kept safe. Oh my goodness. Even if we allow Trump's federal agents to talk to him, they could treat him as a hostile person. He'd be in jeopardy. Yeah, here we have the investigators of a whistleblower. Every single time something goes against the left or the establishment, everything they say is out the window. And we don't need to protect this whistleblower. He's probably a liar. He's probably wrong. No one said that about the whistleblower with Trump. They said, we demand to have the transcript of the phone call. We demand. We want this evidence to be out in the public. We demand. We're impeaching. They didn't say, well, maybe this whistleblower is mistaken. Is it possible that you misinterpreted things? Did you make assumptions about what Trump was saying? In fact, we know he made assumptions because Trump didn't literally say the things on the transcript that were being alleged, such as that he issued a quid pro quo. That didn't happen. But still, we had to protect the whistleblower. Here, the whistleblower is treated like garbage. You know, it's possible to take this stance. It's possible to be on the left and say this. I hate Donald Trump. I wanted to vote for Joe Biden. I think there was a lot of shady things leading up to the election, such as what the media was doing, what the tech companies were doing. I think there were probably dead people that were voted for. I think that this guy was treated like crap and that's unfair. But I still don't see that there's enough evidence that we should overturn the election. That's at least a reasonable take. I can handle that. I disagree. But it's a reasonable take. That's someone who's clearly interested in a good faith conversation. And I could totally see that take. But the silence from many people on the left to even acknowledge any of these obvious facts and double standards is deafening. Where are they? So that's where we're at today with more of the double standards. And again, I really recommend checking out Leslie McAdoo's Twitter thread there, which again, I'll post one more time in the chat. Original 13 says, with the 10K vote difference or even a 30K, I disagree that there was enough to overturn. But again, How many votes do you think were switched by the total propagandizing of the media? Let me give you an example of the original. So yesterday we had someone on the chat here on my channel, and when I brought up the kind of all of the institutions that were against Trump going into the election, and how the left said 12 Russian trolls were enough to steal the 2016 election, but all of these institutions being total propagandists for Joe Biden, that they don't want to talk about that. And this person said the reason that he knows, or she, I don't know if it was he or she, the reason that they know that that didn't influence their vote was because Donald Trump's own language scared people. And that's why they chose to not vote for him or to get out and vote against him. And I said, can you give me an example? And the first thing that this person said was he refused to condemn white supremacy. And so I played a video of 38 times of Trump condemning white supremacy. I had someone a couple weeks ago. I actually want to edit it was a call-in. And the call-in person started off, he said, I'm a Marxist and I believe you have white privilege. That's what he said to me. By the end of that video discussion, it was like a 30 to 40 minute discussion. That person said that Trump called Nazis good people. And he acknowledged that's why he was voting for Joe Biden. That's why Joe Biden said he was running, because Trump called Nazis good people. So I read the transcripts word for word to that person. He said he was shocked. How could the media tell him that if it wasn't true? Now, how many people do you think are out there like that when we're talking 10 to 30,000 votes in some of these states? No, I don't believe that Biden got 75 million votes. I see original. I was misinterpreting what you were saying. But even if there was vote fraud or wasn't vote fraud, which is the argument I'm making now, how many people out there voted because they think Trump said Nazis were good people? How many people out there voted because, according to polling, I believe Rasmussen was the most recent poll I saw, and I think it was in August. I could be wrong. 50% of Democrats polled still believed the allegations in the Steele dossier. How many voted because of that? Because our media collectively and willfully lied to the people and censored any story that was critical of Joe Biden. What was the influence of that? Robert Epstein, a professor, testified in front of the Senate that Google had the ability to manipulate 16 to 22 million votes. I think, as I've spoke, there's evidence of fraud. I guess I'll be debating this tomorrow night, which I'll explain before I leave here. But having said that, even without fraud, if you believe what the Democrats are saying, you have the least energetic presidential candidate probably in history who called a lid on his campaign 80% of the days leading up to the election, who no one was really enthusiastic about. They drug him across the finish line. If they have their ability to manipulate minds and manipulate votes is only going to get stronger as tech becomes more sophisticated and they're able to control more and more of the narrative. It wasn't enough for them to have almost total control of the media, right? Now Fox News is with them, which I would contend it was anyways. Now they're making lists. We got to get conservatives off. Now they got to get conservatives off tech platforms. AOC wants lists. Don't allow these people to have jobs. They have to have total control of the information, and they're going to get it if we don't do something. The more control they get, the more ability they will have to manipulate people to believe the opposite of the truth. Trump's a xenophobic warmonger, says the people that see Russians under every bed. By the way, real quick, while I'm on that, because here's something that I haven't seen anyone bring up, and I think it's worthwhile. It's something that I myself talked about quite frequently, but now we have actual evidence suggesting it. A study of Russia Americans has made clear the shocking extent of Russophobia in the U.S. today. The news comes from after the Kremlin warned that attacks on the country were defining this week's American presidential election. The report, published by a political lobby group called RUPAC, found that more than 44% of U.S.-based Russians surveyed had faced discrimination on the basis of their nationality. Around 1 in 4 reported having felt that they had to hide their background. The way Russia is portrayed in the media and appeared to be the cause of this, with almost 64% of those responding saying the coverage was unfair. It is estimated there are around 3 million Russian Americans living in the U.S. A 2007 census revealed that more than 850,000 people in the country speak Russian as their primary language at home, although many more come from other former Soviet republics. Now, I know this is from Russia Today, and I know polls could be crap, but that is true. And I've talked to people that are Russian Americans that have experienced that. Remember, I did a video like 3 years ago. One of the senators that was a Democrat, I can't remember which one, was suggesting that anyone who had contact with anyone of Russian heritage be investigated and scrutinized as a possible Russian spy. You get that? You speak the language or you're friends with someone who speaks the language, then suspect is cast upon you. That's from the party that they can't wait. If we get attacked in 9/11, wanting to respond, they say, oh, that's Islamophobia. But they could yell, Russia, 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 Russia every day. Where's their bleeding heart for the Russian Americans that are then discriminated against? Oh, they don't care. You never hear them talk about that, do they? Now, I'm not saying that if you legitimately think that there's a security concern from a country that you shouldn't talk about it because you're afraid that people that come from that country in this country will be discriminated. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is if, once more, we hold the left to their own standards where they want to shout Islamophobia or, you're a Sinophile. You're hurting Asian Americans by wanting to stop travel from China where COVID came from. That's discriminatory against Asian Americans. Why haven't they said a word about Russian Americans? 3 million of them in this country. They don't care? That discrimination doesn't matter because it's being led by McCarthyism on the left that want to shout Russia about everything? It's absolutely absurd. I can talk real quick. I got a couple minutes, then I got to go. Jay Rohr says Joe Biden lockdown will last 4 to 6 weeks. That's what they're suggesting. Here's my prediction. November 12th, 2020. Here's my prediction. Joe Biden will have some sort of national lockdown or national mask mandate. This will be unable to be enforced. Republican governors like Ron DeSantis will say, I'm not going to listen to this, and will challenge it. This will be 4 to 6 weeks. That sounds about right. This is what I predicted. And then it'll be lifted. And suddenly, COVID will be gone. See, everyone's saying magically COVID will disappear once Joe Biden's elected. And that's true. It's not that COVID will disappear. It's a disease. It's serious. But it's nowhere near catastrophic like it's been suggested. It didn't justify the lockdowns at all. There's no evidence that the lockdown saved any lives. There's plenty of evidence that it actually killed a lot of people and that it's going to economically affect millions of people for years to come. But the left and the establishment used this for political power, and it worked. I would bet a lot of the legitimate votes cast against Donald Trump was over COVID. Because the left used it as a political tool. So people have been saying, they'll stop using it as a political tool if Biden wins. They'll say, see, everything's better. Yeah, it's still out there, but it's managed now. Now it's managed. Look, not many people are dying. And not young people, it's just people in a certain demographic, elderly, with comorbidities. But the rest of us are healthy. No need for the lockdowns and things like that. And that is true. That's what will happen. But they can't just say that because they know that people will get wise to it. So instead, what they'll do is they'll make it look like Joe Biden did something. A mandate, a mask mandate, a lockdown. Even if people don't follow it, they'll make it seem like, Joe Biden did something. And then they'll say, no more lockdowns needed. All we had to do was lock down for 4 to 6 weeks. Even though certain states didn't do it, that's it. That's all we had to do. Joe Biden's leadership cured COVID. So I predict there will be a short-term period where there'll be some sort of mask mandate or lockdown that most people won't follow and it won't be heavily enforced. And then it'll be lifted. And then we'll be told everything's great. Yeah, it's great. We don't need to lock down anymore. And then they'll give you a stimulus check. They're going to do it. By the way, this is good news for millions of Americans that are struggling. You're going to get a check. It'll be the Democrats. The Democrats gave you that check. That's what'll happen. And then millions of people are going to be like, wow, maybe we're right. Maybe Trump did cause COVID. As soon as Biden got in, it got fixed. We started to get money. This is great. That's what's going to happen. I don't predict Joe Biden will do anything radical in the first 6 to 12 months. He'll do some stuff to appease the progressive left. He'll re-enter the Paris Climate Accord. Why? Because we're already meeting our obligations. So what this is a virtue signal to the progressives. Oh, see, climate change. But it doesn't actually require doing anything right now because under Trump, we're already meeting those goals. So that'll look good to the progressives. I don't look for him to stack the courts or anything like that initially. He's going to try to come off as, no, see, I'm a very reasonable, moderate guy. That's going to be the goal initially. Because they know there's a lot of unrest and people don't trust things. And the way that you dissuade people when you start to make them say, well, maybe this isn't so bad. Give them money. End the lockdowns. Don't be radical. That's going to be what he does. Until about a year or so in. Then you're going to start to see things behind the scenes. He will, by the way, almost immediately put critical race theory back in, which is horrible. That's racism. So he'll mandate that it be taught in federal agencies again. But other than that, for a year or so, things will seem okay. Life will get back to normal. Again, the point was, if you have an incumbent, the more you could make people miserable, no matter what, through COVID, through lockdowns, through riots, it doesn't matter. The more you make their life miserable, even if it doesn't make sense, the guy at top gets blamed. Trump's going to get blamed. So if things get markedly better, it doesn't matter if Biden has anything to do with it. He's going to get credit. All the Biden voters that were burning down city after city, if you live in one of those cities and your business got burned down, you're a black business owner who lost your business in Chicago or Milwaukee or Atlanta or Detroit or New York or DC, whatever, Portland, Seattle. And you're like, geez, there was rioting all the time. Now that Biden's in there, the rioting stopped. Yeah, maybe this was it. The Democrats told you this. Vote for us or we'll burn everything down. That was their game. They know it. Where are all the riots? Remember the riots when Trump won in 2016? I do. They would have been even worse this time. Where are the Trump supporters rioting? But trust them. The left has the moral high ground. Trust them. They're good, noble people. Then they'll push the HEROES Act. They'll push universal mail-in voting. They'll push amnesty. It'll take about a year, but they'll get around to all this before the 2022 election. They're going to push amnesty and path to citizenship for millions of illegals. We'll get involved in another war. We'll stop the tariffs against China, our biggest enemy. We'll probably increase our presence in places like Syria. Getting more hostile, getting more of our troops killed. Military-industrial complex, be happy. The neocons and the neolibs will be happy. And all of your Democratic friends that told you how Trump was a xenophobe will be making excuses why you're a racist xenophobe for not wanting to send more troops overseas. That's what they'll be telling you. That's how great this propaganda is. It could literally convince people the opposite of the truth. If you're against the war, then you're a warmongering xenophobe. You get it? You get how that works? If you're against bombing brown people, then you're a racist who wants to kill brown people. You get it? Oh yeah, the rioting will go down. We all know the riots were tacitly approved by the Democrats. There'll be a small handful and they'll be crushed because the media and these Democratic mayors won't accept it if it's riots against Biden. If it's riots against Democrats, they won't accept it. But by and large, the majority of the rioters just wanted Trump removed and they wanted a Democrat. So they'll stop rioting. And in 2024, if Trump runs again, or if there's any kind of populist Republican that ends up running, they'll riot again. It worked. Why wouldn't they? That's the lesson learned. The lesson learned from this election is it's okay for the FBI for 4 years to spy on a president just because they don't like him and to work as an apparatus of the Democratic Party. It's okay to send old people into nursing homes and cause tens of thousands of deaths from COVID. It's okay to strip people of their rights arbitrarily and allow Republicans to be stripped of their rights, but Black Lives Matter, the Antifa, and them to have any rights that they want. It's okay to strip people of their rights to go to church, but you can allow them to go to the liquor store. It's okay to burn stuff down. You'll be rewarded. There's no punishment. So it'll look calm for 4 years, calmer than it has. And then, when it looks like they might lose an election 4 years from now, they'll have rigged it even more by then, so it'll be even more difficult to win. But then you'll see the return of riots. You'll see the return of, racism, systemic racism everywhere. You'll see the return of, we have to because Biden's in charge, it won't be lockdowns. And then if they lose, they'll make our country's life hell for 4 years. Again, that's it. There was no punishment. It has been rewarded. So that's what will happen. Jack Hextealer says, okay, can we stop with the vaccines being bad, Lady Death Kiss? I don't know. Why don't you talk to Cuomo? He's the one out there saying currently right now he wouldn't trust the Pfizer vaccine. Isn't it funny how people want to say anti-vaxxers and come on small channels with random internet people and criticize them, but when we actually have the leadership of the Democratic Party criticizing the vaccine, they don't have a problem with that. They're not out there speaking out against that. As if some random person on my chat has more influence in this country than the governor of New York, who's also questioning the vaccine. Jack Hextealer says, Trump ran as a populist, ruled like establishment. I'd love for him to see how he lost and decide to just throw caution to the wind and make true change. But guess what he's doing instead? More sanctions for Iran. Jack, I don't disagree with you. I think that Trump meant well and he trusted people. Trump's like a delegator, right? I don't think he's got expertise in a lot of these things. He just has gut feelings and then he appoints people around him that he trusts. The problem was his bold claim that I only appoint the best people was garbage. Regardless if it was intentional or accidental, because he trusted people, he appointed people that did not have our country or his best interest at heart. Hence bombing Syria. And a lot of other things we've seen. I support Trump totally. I think he meant well. But he failed. He did not drain the swamp. The swamp, if Biden wins this election, which looks likely, the swamp beat him. No one in the swamp ever faced serious consequences, so they'll continue to engage in their corruption. And so, Jack, you have every right to say, you say what you want about Trump. You could say he was a populist. You say he supported. At the end of the day, what happened? That is a fair criticism. I am with you 100%. He should be making change. He should be declassifying everything. He should pardon Assange, pardon Snowden, pardon all the whistleblowers. He should release all the documents about the coup attempt against him with the Russiagate stuff. He should start releasing documents that show CIA drug running and things like that. The surveillance that occurred on MLK, the JFK files. Who got the congressional slush fund that used your tax dollars to settle sexual assault allegations? All of that, he should release. I totally agree with you, Jack. And if he doesn't do that, that's more failure on Trump's part. I'm not here to sit here and say, I support Trump no matter what he does. I've criticized him all the time. All the time. I criticized him for endorsing the lockdowns. And I had tons of Trump supporters tell me, how dare you criticize Trump? Who was right on that? So I don't disagree with you, Jack. And I think that sanctions can sometimes be useful, but I agree with you. Oftentimes what happens is sanctions end up hurting the people on the ground, and the corrupt leadership of these countries don't really feel the effects of that sanction. It's difficult. I also criticize many sanctions because I think that oftentimes they have the reverse intended effect. But I could also understand that sometimes they are applicable. And I don't view sanctions as immoral as actually bombing countries, because I could see how a person would think that it's a more humane way, even if you look at the end results, and sometimes it's not. However, given Trump's success in the Middle East, I hesitate to question, unless he's dropping bombs, I hesitate to question his strategy, because he's clearly had a lot of success with peace deals in the Middle East. And a lot of that has to do with pressuring what was seen as states that were blocking that, like Iran. So he's forced people to kind of ally or forgive each other outside of that umbrella of Iran having control over a lot of them, influentially wise, which has led to some market successes. But, okay, that's the show for the day. I got 4 dogs here. I'm dog sitting. So let me just give you a brief rundown of what's going on. I agree. A lot of the... And look, I'm not totally against dropping bombs. If we're fighting a known enemy such as ISIS or something like that, that's different than trying to change the regime of a country. Right? I'm not a pacifist that says we shouldn't go after Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and places like that. But oftentimes, these bombs that are being dropped are being done so for reasons other than just that. And I'm for scrutinizing every single time that Trump authorized military force. The reason I'm for that is because I've seen military force be authorized throughout my lifetime so corruptly that the very least, before we drop a bomb or send a soldier somewhere, we better be damn sure that that's the necessary thing to do. And the American people ought to have transparency to see that that's the correct decision. So I don't disagree with you. However, for all of the bombs that Trump dropped, he did not get us in another foreign regime change war. And he's the first president, I believe, in over 20 years that can make that claim. We will see how Joe Biden will be as peaceful as possible and be friendly as possible with China, who is our biggest geopolitical rival. But I will guarantee within 8 years, if there's 8 years of a Democratic administration, we will be involved in another overseas war with boots on the ground. Guarantee it. But all right, so that's the end of the show today. I got to take care of these dogs. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Donations are always appreciated. If you want to donate to me financially, you can find, if you go to my YouTube page, you can find access to my PayPal, my Patreon. You could also donate to me through the platform that you're watching right now. If you ever want to send me an email, or if you'd want to donate to me through mail or something like that, my email is real simple. It's rob.noerr, Noerr, @gmail.com. Email me about anything if you want to make a donation, if you want to send me a book or something like that. I could give you my post office box. I clearly don't want to do that just for everyone here. But yeah, so that's what's going. Tomorrow night, unless something changes, I think I'll be on Dylan Burns' Hippy Dippy podcast, and I'll be debating some left-wingers, including Valsh, who's apparently a bigger left-winger. I only know a very limited amount about him, but yeah, so I will be doing that tomorrow night at 8 p.m. I might be a little late to that because I have work stuff going on, but just to give you a heads up, I will be doing my normal show at 8 a.m. tomorrow. If I could recommend, I know people said D-Live was having some problems. I'm going to work on that. But if I could recommend, please consider, if you're on YouTube, following me on a different platform. YouTube will begin purging conservative commentators even more once the Democrats get in office. So you should really consider diversifying and not just following people on YouTube. Yeah, I don't know much about Vaush. I've heard a couple things, but I'm going to withhold judgment until I get to personally talk to him. We'll see what happens. But the topics of that debate will be, was there substantial election fraud? How will Trump's presidency be remembered? And what should we do as far as climate change policy moving forward? So, yeah, it should be an interesting debate. It's a 4-on-4 panel debate, so we'll see how it goes. Other than that, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate each and every one of you, even those that disagree. I thought it was another good show. I do apologize if I was too on people in the chat earlier this week. I'm fallible as anyone else, so it is something that I'm trying to get better. I want to keep my intensity up and my passion up, but also understand that, you know, name calling and stuff like that doesn't serve anyone, even if that's what's being done to me. So apologize if you were offended by any of that previously. So thank you so much. I will be heading out for the evening. Got some work to do. Or evening. Feels like evening. I'll be heading out for the day. I got some work to do today. So I appreciate all of you. And as always, have a good one.